The last time my father looked me in the eyes, he didn't see a daughter. He saw a disappointment he could discard. He smirked, arm wrapped around his mistress, a newborn in her arms, while my mother stood trembling beside me. That was the day I realized silence had carved scars deeper than any words could. My name is Marjorie Benton, and this is the story of what happened when my grandmother's final wishes shattered the life my father thought he controlled. Rain poured down over Providence, turning the narrow streets into dark rivers that reflected the blur of streetlights. Each step my mother and I took echoed against the slick pavement, the rhythm sharp, steady, yet trembling with unspoken dread. Her hand clung to mine, cold and shaking, though she tried to keep her chin lifted. Ahead loomed the gray stone building where the will would be read, its windows glowing dimly against the storm. But what stopped me wasn't the structure itself. It was the figure waiting at its steps. My father, Richard Benton, stood pristine in a tailored suit, his tie knotted tight, every detail immaculate. The storm hadn't touched him. He looked untouched, untouchable, as if the rain itself wouldn't dare cross his path. At his side was a young woman, Clara James. Her arm cradled a newborn, wrapped in a white blanket, embroidered with a tiny crown. She leaned close to him beneath the umbrella, perfectly composed, her smile sharpened into triumph. Together they looked staged, rehearsed, as though this moment were a photo op instead of a grieving family gathering. Clara's eyes locked on mine, daring me to flinch. The baby shifted, letting out a faint cry, and she pressed her lips to its forehead with exaggerated grace. My father folded his arms across his chest and tilted his head in that old, cutting way, the smirk that once made me feel small enough to vanish. Beside me, my mother's shoulders shook under the rain-soaked fabric of her coat. Her fingers gripped mine tighter, icy but insistent. I steadied her, steadied myself, whispering inwardly, this wasn't just about inheritance. This was a trial of blood, betrayal, and truth, and I was no longer afraid to take my place in it. The conference room felt less like a place for grieving and more like a chamber of judgment. Dark wood panels climbed the walls, the chandelier hanging low above the long mahogany table. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and polished leather, pressing down like a verdict waiting to be spoken. My mother and I sat on one side, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while across from us my father leaned back with calculated ease. Clara adjusted her hair with one hand and balanced the infant on her shoulder with the other, her gaze sweeping across the room as if she owned it. My father's fingers tapped steadily against the table, the same rhythm I had heard so many times when he presided over a boardroom. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat and opened the folder with careful precision. His voice carried evenly, but the weight of each word settled like stone. For Richard Benton, he read. The portrait of the family hanging in the Newport parlor? My father's eyes flickered, his brow tightened, the faint curve of his mouth, that practiced smile, faltered. And for Clara James, Whitaker continued, no specific inheritance is granted. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara froze, her arms stiffening around the child, lips pressed tight as she forced herself not to react. My mother gasped softly, covering it with her hand, while I sat utterly still, watching the cracks form in the performance across the table. My father leaned forward, voice rasping with disbelief. Is that all? Whitaker didn't blink. We will proceed. The air seemed to shift in that instant. The mask of control my father wore so easily had begun to slip, and for the first time, I saw the edge of fear beneath his composure. Just as Whitaker adjusted the folder to move on, he reached for a smaller envelope at the edge of the table. The cream paper was worn at the corners, the ink across the front unmistakable. My name stared back at me in my grandmother's hand. Marjorie Benton. The sound of my own pulse roared in my ears. Every eye in the room turned toward it. My father leaned back slowly, but his hand clenched so tight on the armrest that his knuckles paled. Clara shifted, whispering sharply into his ear, though her lips stretched into a fragile smile. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Just sentimentality. Don't let it shake you." But I saw the flicker in his gaze, the shadow that crossed his expression. He wasn't as certain as he wanted her to believe. I didn't reach for the envelope. I let it rest there, squarely between us, a silent piece of evidence no one could ignore. My grandmother's script gleamed under the light, steady, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. In that moment, the room was no longer about legal formalities. That envelope sat like a loaded chamber, and everyone knew when it opened. Nothing would remain the same. Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, his voice measured but cutting through the silence like a blade. "To Marjorie Benton," he read, "I leave the entirety of my estate, the Newport property, all investment accounts, and full company shares." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My chest tightened as the weight of them settled over me. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the scrape of my father's chair broke the stillness as he shot to his feet, the legs shrieking against the polished wood. "This is outrageous!" he barked, his face darkening. "She was coerced, manipulated. My mother would never write such nonsense." Clara lurched forward, clutching the infant closer to her chest, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This child is the bloodline. Margaret told us herself. She wanted everything secured for her great-grandson. This was supposed to be his future." Whitaker closed the folder with deliberate calm, his gaze steady. "There is no clause acknowledging a minor heir. The provisions are specific, signed, and notarized. The will is fully enforceable under the law." My father slammed his hand against the table, the veins in his neck straining. His rage crackled like static in the air. Clara's composure cracked, her desperate performance unraveling before us. My mother trembled at my side, and her fragile hand found mine, whispering through trembling lips, "Don't be afraid, darling." The room felt like a battlefield without raised weapons, only words and glances cutting sharper than steel. Whitaker's calm presence became the gavel of justice, each syllable shaping the trial none of us had prepared for. Whitaker reached for the cream envelope lying at the edge of the table. The paper crackled as he slid a finger beneath the flap, unfolding a single sheet written in a familiar slanting hand. The blue ink gleamed faintly under the chandelier's glow. His voice softened, but each word landed with precision. "Marjorie, silence is not the same as small. You have endured, you have stood, and now I entrust you with freedom. Richard, you chose power over kindness. Charm is not character. Applause is not love. Control is not care." My father sat rigid, his lips twitching before he let out a harsh laugh. She didn't even know what she was writing. But the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. Something darker, something closer to fear. Whitaker continued, steady as a judge delivering sentence. "And finally, should Marjorie refuse this inheritance, the estate in its entirety will be transferred to the Providence Community Fund for the building of a new school." The impact struck like thunder. Clara's face blanched. She half rose, voice breaking as she shouted. "She would give away everything to strangers? To people outside this family?" The silence that followed was deafening. My pulse thundered as I drew a long breath. It was no longer a question of wealth. It was responsibility. A torch passed with the weight of generations. I hadn't just been given property and accounts. I had been handed a choice that could alter the legacy of my family and the future of a city. The burden pressed heavy, but so did the truth. For the first time, the power was mine. When the reading ended, my father stormed out of the room like a wounded animal. I held on to my mother as we walked into the damp hallway, her steps unsteady, my chest heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. I thought perhaps he would retreat into silence, lick his wounds, and plot his next move in private. I was wrong. 2 days later, Providence was buzzing. Headlines splashed his name across the news. Richard Benton had hired a team of attorneys and filed suit to contest the will, demanding it be overturned. Reporters hounded me. Former colleagues from the courthouse called, some out of curiosity, some out of morbid fascination. My father was painting himself as the victim, a dutiful son wronged by a manipulative granddaughter. Clara sat beside him during interviews, her makeup flawless, her smile brittle. Her eyes, though, told the truth. There was no loyalty left, only calculation. That night, in our small kitchen, my mother whispered across the table, voice trembling but resolute. "He's fooling the world, the way he once fooled me." Her words cut deeper than any headline. Days later, the truth cracked open. My father's company was drowning in debt, millions unpaid, investors fleeing in droves. Clara vanished with the baby, leaving no trace but the silence of betrayal. And then, in the dead of night, my phone rang. His voice rasped through the line, desperate, broken. "She's gone. She took the child. Don't you see? It's still just us. We're family." But for the first time, his plea carried no power, only emptiness. I returned to Newport alone. The sea pounded against the cliffs, waves roaring as though echoing the turmoil inside me. The old wooden house groaned under the wind, its shutters rattling. Inside, dust clung to the bookshelves, the air heavy with salt and time. I searched through drawers until my hand brushed something at the very back of a desk, a stack of worn leather journals. The corners frayed, the ink faded. Beneath the yellowed lamplight, my grandmother's slanted script spilled across the page. My father forced me to marry for the family's honor. I stayed silent too long. If no one ends this cycle, the next generation will live in the same chains. The words shook me. Each line revealed a history of women in our family, bound by silence. Their lives pressed under the weight of men who mistook control for love. My throat tightened as I read page after page, the echoes of pain threading through decades. Behind me, the floor creaked. My mother stood in the doorway, her eyes swollen, her voice low. "I knew pieces of it," she admitted, "but I never had the strength to tell you." I closed the journal carefully, pressing it to my chest. This was no longer about inheritance or property. It was about a mission entrusted to me, one my grandmother had written into every word she left behind. I understood then. She hadn't simply left me her estate. She had chosen me to break the chain. The wind battered the windows, carrying with it the sting of salt and rain that slapped against the glass. I sat in the dim study of the Newport house, the journals my grandmother left still open across the desk, their pages whispering truths too long buried. The storm outside felt like an echo of the storm inside me. The door creaked, then burst open with a gust of cold air. My father stepped inside. Gone was the man in tailored suits who strutted through boardrooms. His shirt clung wrinkled and damp to his frame. His tie hung slack, his face hollowed and pale. The fire that once burned so easily in his eyes had burned itself to ash. He stood there, his voice scraping like gravel. "You have it all now. Just give me a portion, enough to save the company. If there's even a shred of blood between us, you'll do this." For a fleeting second, I saw the man who once held my hand on the way to school, the one I thought would protect me, but the memory shattered beneath another. His cold voice calling me a burden, dismissing me when I chose the law over his approval. I rose slowly, spine straight, voice even. "I used to wish you'd see me. I don't anymore. All you have left are consequences." He faltered, reaching out as if to touch me, to reclaim authority that no longer existed. I stepped back. In the doorway, my mother appeared. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze was stripped of hope, emptied of illusion. The house groaned under the storm as silence filled the space between us, right there, in the ancestral heart of his power. I ended it. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, signatures, and decisions that carried more weight than numbers on a page. I sold what I didn't need, piece by piece, and when the first transfer cleared, I wrote a check to my mother, on the memo line, in small letters. I wrote, "For all the years you held everything together." When she saw it, she pressed the paper to her chest and broke down. sobbing into my arms. Through her tears, she whispered, "I never wanted anything more than to know you saw me." That was enough. That had always been enough. I kept the Newport house, its walls lined with the echoes of my grandmother's words. But the rest I channeled into something new, a place not for legacy or pride, but for healing. I called it the Lantern House. It rose in the heart of Providence, painted a soft cream that glowed in the afternoon light. Golden lanterns hung above the windows and doors, their warm shine spilling out into the misty streets, cutting through drizzle and fog. On opening day, I stood behind the counter in a plain cardigan, flour still dusted on my sleeves from the muffins cooling in the back. The door creaked open to reveal two elderly sisters, their coats buttoned tight. They shuffled in and went straight to the shelves, fingertips brushing the spines of used books, until one of them smiled, clutching a volume like an old friend. Next came a young mother with a child at her hip, eyes weary but grateful. She sank into a chair by the window while her son curled up beside her, already flipping pages. Later, a teenage boy wandered in, math homework clutched in his hands, asking softly if someone could help him. I watched them claim the space as if it had been waiting for them all along. My chest loosened in a way it hadn't in years. For the first time, what my grandmother left me didn't feel like a burden chained to my name. It felt like a seed planted, finally sprouting. Near closing time, a woman lingered by the door, her eyes tracing the lanterns that swayed gently in the wind. "Why lantern?" she asked me. I smiled, thinking of my grandmother's handwriting in blue ink, her voice echoing across time. "Because even the smallest light can guide someone who's lost." The woman nodded, her lips trembling into a smile, and stepped out into the rain, the glow of the lanterns following her down the street. That night, I locked the door and stood alone in the golden light, listening to the quiet hum of belonging that filled the walls. The inheritance no longer bound me to my father's shadow. It had become something living, something that could outlast bitterness. It wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed a light. The year was winding to a close when the rain returned, soft and steady, drifting down like a lullaby instead of a storm. My mother and I stood together on the porch, the wooden boards creaking gently beneath our feet. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke, the kind of scent that belonged to winter in New England. Drops slid down the eaves, catching the light before falling into the soil below. I felt her lean into me, her wool cardigan brushing against my arm. She tilted her face toward the rain, her silver hair catching the pale light of dusk. "The rain isn't cold anymore," she whispered. Her voice was quiet, but it carried something stronger than I'd ever heard in her. Peace. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle into me like warmth against the chill. In the hush of that moment, I heard my grandmother again, the words from her letter echoing through the years. "Silence is not the same as small. Live. Don't just endure." When I opened my eyes, I saw the glow of Lantern House down the street, its golden light spilled across the wet pavement, lanterns swaying gently in the wind. Inside, children laughed, their voices rising and falling in bursts of joy. A group of women sat together near the window, steam rising from mugs cupped in their hands. The place was alive, filled with the kind of belonging my grandmother had dreamed of, the kind of belonging she had passed to me. For so long, I had believed my story was tethered to my father's shadow, to the years of his disapproval and the silence it carved into me. But standing there with my mother, hearing her words, and seeing the life growing from the inheritance I once feared, I knew the cycle was broken. My grandmother's legacy wasn't measured in houses or accounts. It was alive in the laughter behind those windows, in the lanterns that pushed back the dark. It was never about revenge. It was about release. It was never about ownership. It was about sharing. The rain fell softly on my face, and I didn't shrink from it. For the first time, it didn't weigh me down. It washed me clean. I felt my mother's hand slip into mine, steady and warm, and together we watched the light ripple across Providence. For years, Rain had meant grief, silence, and the ache of being unseen. But that evening, standing on that porch, I felt the truth settle into my bones. For the first time in my life, the rain belonged to me,